Okay, calm down.
So tell us what has happened. What is the latest? This has been a very neglected story by the mainstream media, the establishment media. I think the lever has really pushed, been a trailblazer in terms of this story. What have you discovered, and what do people need to know about what happened in East Palestine?
Well, there are a lot of places you could start this story, but the short version of it is that, on February 3rd, a Norfolk Southern train traveling through East Palestine, Ohio, derailed and started on fire, and then there was a toxic chemical plume released as the railroad burned off the hazardous chemicals that were being carried by some of the tank cars. Sort of the status now is that EPA is on the ground, the Environmental Protection Agency is on the ground, sort of overseeing cleanup efforts, which it's just announced it's going to force Norfolk Southern to pay for. Meanwhile, sort of there's immense pressure on the Biden administration to tackle some of the root causes that allowed this derailment to happen, namely sort of the railroad industry spending all of its money on stock buybacks, not all of its money, of course, but spending more of its profits on stock buybacks than investments in the railroads and its workforce, which has sort of been enabled by multiple presidential administrations and Congresses.
There's a lot of blame to go around, right? But where are some of the places that we should be assigning blame?
I mean, the most obvious place to point fingers is Norfolk Southern. Sort of the railroads themselves have just been unbelievably greedy over the past decade. Something happens when you do a lot of reporting on corporate malfeasance and corporate influence on government, where like every time you write about an industry, it's like, oh, is this the most evil industry? And yet I think it may be the railroads. They have sort of made this shift, as many industries have, to sort of solely focus on returning profits to shareholders. Meanwhile, over the past decade, they've cut their workforces by nearly 30%. Workforces were already declining on the railroads, and they have fought tooth and nail against safety regulations, such as updating their trains with better braking technologies, mandating two-man crews on trains, things like that. So this is an industry that is sort of singularly focused on profits. Its trains are derailing quite frequently. It's carrying, hazardous materials, crude oil on trains, and fighting safety regulations for those trains.
And what kind of environmental damage and public health damage has already been documented?
Yeah, so there sort of was the initial problem of primarily vinyl chloride, one of the chemicals being carried on this train, sort of lingering in the air because it's toxic and carcinogenic, and you don't want to be inhaling it. So there were sort of immediate air quality concerns, but then the bigger problem is sort of that vinyl chloride lingers. It lingers in the walls of people's homes, it lingers in the soil, it lingers in the water. There were other chemicals aboard the train that were also released and are now sort of in the water and in the soil. So there are sort of vast environmental concerns that I think are still sort of being uncovered. The residents are concerned, of course, because some of the water testing initially was carried out by a consulting firm paid by Norfolk Southern. Norfolk Southern itself was doing some of the home testing. And it's like this, is a company that just allowed a hazardous train to derail in your town and released a mushroom cloud. Why should you trust it to sort of be ensuring that your community is safe?
Right. Yeah, that doesn't sound too good. What is being done to protect people right now?
Yeah. So, one thing that's happening again is that EPA is sort of on the ground conducting testing and overseeing Norfolk Southern's remediation efforts, which seems like a very positive step. But there's sort of a multitude of things happening. There's also sort of this broader focus on how the railroad industry even reached a point where something like this could happen. And so, there's focus both on EPA and the Ohio EPA to sort of ensure that the water is safe, that the air is safe, that people's homes are safe, but also a focus on the railroad industry. And tens of millions of Americans live within the evacuation zones of railroads. So, if this can happen in East Palestine, there's a feeling that could happen anywhere. And it does happen in all sorts of places. I mean, more than 1,000 trains derail every year. So I think there's sort of this question of what is the Biden administration going to do to rein in this industry, if anything? What is Congress going to do? There are voices from both sides of the aisle right now sort of criticizing the lack of railroad regulations. Some of these criticisms are a little bit dubious because they're coming from Republicans who themselves have voted,
right.
To repeal rail safety rules. But there's sort of this broader question of like looking beyond East Palestine. How do we make sure this doesn't happen again, which it inevitably will in the short term, but there need to be sort of longer term efforts to rein in the industry.
And are we seeing it happening other places?
Are we seeing derailments happen in other
Yeah.
places? I mean, yes, absolutely. I think it was maybe it was the day after the East Palestine derailment, or it was the day after national media started covering the East Palestine derailment. There was another high profile hazardous train derailment. I think there was just one in Houston. I mean, they're happening sort of everywhere all the time.
Michigan, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I
So
believe, yeah.
there's sort of no doubt that this is going to continue to happen if nothing is done to change the rules.